The church was draped in an air of sorrow as the mourners gathered around the wooden coffin. The heavy toll of the bells echoed through the small village, marking the solemn farewell to Jack. Grace stood at the edge of the gathering, her hand tightly gripping the tiny, trembling hand of her daughter Emma. The 2-year-old had been unusually quiet since they arrived, her eyes wide with confusion, her small face flushed from crying. Grace's heart ached with the loss of her husband, but she could feel Emma's distress too. She bent down to comfort her daughter, but Emma's body stiffened in her arms, her gaze fixed firmly on the coffin. "Papa! Papa!" Emma whimpered, her tiny fingers pointing toward the dark wooden box. The crowd, dressed in mourning, shuffled nervously, exchanging glances. Grace tried to soothe her, brushing a hand through Emma's wild curls, but the little girl only struggled more, pointing at the coffin with trembling hands. "Emma, sweetheart, calm down," Grace whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Papa's gone, remember? He's not here." But Emma wouldn't listen. Her eyes grew wide, filled with both fear and confusion. "Papa's calling. He's calling for me," she said, her voice cracking as she repeated the words. A cold chill swept through the air, and the villagers began to murmur amongst themselves. Grace's heart began to race, as a sense of unease wrapped itself around her chest. What was Emma seeing? The little girl couldn't possibly understand death, could she? "Papa's trapped," Emma said, her voice louder now. "Papa's stuck. He needs help." The words fell heavily in the silent room, and Grace felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting nervously from Emma to the coffin, and then to Grace. A few elderly women whispered behind their hands, exchanging worried looks. Grace's stomach churned as she tightened her grip on Emma. Could it be that Emma was simply speaking out of grief? Was this some manifestation of the child's confused mind, unable to process her father's sudden death? But no. Something inside Grace told her that there was more to Emma's words than just childish fantasy. The villagers, who had always respected the unexplainable, seemed unsettled by what they were hearing. The whispers grew louder. "What if the child is seeing something? There's no telling what the spirits can do," one voice said, almost too quiet to hear. Another voice added, "Maybe it's a sign. But what kind of sign?" Grace's heart pounded in her chest, the doubts swirling in her mind. She glanced at the coffin, her breath catching in her throat. It was still, silent. But in the pit of her stomach, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Was Emma really just imagining things, or was there some truth behind her words? "Emma, stop," Grace said, trying to steady her shaking hands. She bent closer to her daughter's tear-streaked face. "Papa is gone. He's not calling for you." But Emma wasn't listening. "Papa's scared. He's calling for Mama," Emma insisted again, her voice rising in pitch. The room grew colder, as if the walls themselves were listening, holding their breath. The light from the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls of the church. Grace felt a knot form in her throat, her thoughts racing, but she couldn't find the words to comfort Emma, not when her daughter's words seemed to carry such weight. "Papa is calling," Emma whispered again, her tiny hand still pointed toward the coffin, unwavering. The tension in the room thickened, as if the air itself was charged with an unspoken fear. Grace's pulse raced, her eyes darting around the room, locking with a few other mourners. They were staring at Emma, uncertain, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. Grace tried to shake off the feeling of dread that settled in her stomach, but it clung to her like a cold shadow. She had to focus. She had to calm Emma. But as Emma continued to insist, something in Grace's chest tightened, something she couldn't explain. Was it just grief, playing tricks on a child's innocent mind? Or was there something more, something she couldn't yet understand? Grace's mind raced, unsure whether to trust her daughter's eerie claims or dismiss them as nothing more than the result of the pain they all shared. The church seemed to hold its breath as Grace struggled to make sense of it all. Emma's cries grew louder, more insistent. She wouldn't let go of the coffin, her small body trembling with a fear that Grace couldn't ignore. The villagers, once quiet in their mourning, now seemed to shift uneasily, exchanging fearful glances. Grace tried to calm herself, to find peace, but the questions swirled around her like a storm. What if Emma was seeing something no one else could? What if Jack was still out there calling for help? The tension was palpable. The weight of the unanswered questions hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the grieving congregation. What would happen next? The answer was still unknown, but the suspense lingered, heavy in the silence. Grace could only stand there, heart racing, holding her daughter tightly, trying to steady herself in the face of the unknown. The mourners filled St. Margaret's Church, each one weighed down by grief, their faces etched with sorrow. The thick scent of incense hung in the air, mixing with the faint smell of the freshly cut flowers that lined the pews. Candles flickered along the altar, their flames wavering in the heavy air. At the front of the church stood Jack's coffin, a dark wooden box draped with flowers. The cold, lifeless presence of the man inside seemed to loom over the congregation, and the air felt thick with loss. It was a scene that spoke of finality, of something that could not be undone. Grace stood near the coffin, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red from crying, but she tried to maintain some semblance of composure. The pain in her heart was a weight she could hardly bear. Jack, her beloved husband, was gone, and she still couldn't quite process it. The events of the past few days felt like a blur. One moment, Jack had kissed her goodbye before leaving the house, and the next, he was gone, taken too suddenly, too violently. It didn't feel real. But here she was, standing at his funeral, surrounded by people who had come to pay their respects. Beside her, Emma, her 2-year-old daughter, clung to her tightly, her small body trembling. The little girl was still in shock, her innocent mind unable to fully grasp what had happened. Emma's tear-streaked face looked up at her mother with big, frightened eyes, her little fingers wrapped around Grace's hand. But Emma wasn't focused on her mother. Her eyes were fixed on the coffin, and she refused to look away. "Papa, Papa," Emma whispered, pointing toward the coffin with a trembling finger. "Papa is stuck. Papa is trapped." Grace's heart clenched at her daughter's words. She had tried to explain it to Emma over and over, but the little girl didn't understand. The grief was too much for her to process. She couldn't grasp the permanence of death, and her mind, still pure and untainted by the complexities of life, seemed to latch onto the idea that Jack was simply trapped somewhere, waiting for someone to save him. Emma's innocent words sent a chill down Grace's spine, especially when the child began sobbing, her little hands shaking as she pointed to the dark corner of the room. Grace bent down to her daughter, brushing the damp curls from her forehead. "Emma, sweetheart," she said gently, trying to soothe the child. "Papa's gone. He's not trapped. He's in heaven now." But Emma wasn't listening. She pushed away from her mother's embrace, her gaze still fixed on the coffin. "Papa is calling," she repeated, her voice a mixture of confusion and fear. "Mama, help Papa. He's stuck." The more Grace tried to comfort her, the more Emma resisted, her small body stiff with anxiety. The mourners around them began to stir, exchanging uneasy glances. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some muttered prayers, some made the sign of the cross, but none dared approach the grieving mother and child. "Is the child seeing something?" someone whispered from the back of the room. The murmur spread like wildfire. Grace's skin crawled with discomfort. She wasn't sure if she was more disturbed by Emma's outbursts or by the unsettling energy in the air. People around her seemed to be looking at Emma as though they were expecting something supernatural to happen. Could it be that the child was sensing something they could not? Could she really be seeing Jack? Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so uncertain, so vulnerable. "Grace, my dear," a soft voice said from behind her. It was Madame Jane, the elderly woman who had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. Madame Jane had always been known for her wisdom, her insight into matters both spiritual and worldly. But today, even her steady demeanor seemed to waver slightly. She placed a comforting hand on Grace's shoulder, her voice a whisper full of concern. "Is Emma all right?" Madame Jane asked. Her eyes flickered to the child, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, still pointing at the coffin. Grace swallowed hard, trying to steady her own shaking hands. "She's just confused," Grace murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. The weight of the atmosphere was suffocating. "She doesn't understand." Madame Jane studied Emma for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were searching for something deeper. "There are things beyond our understanding," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Children often see what we cannot. Sometimes they sense things that are hidden from our eyes." Grace didn't know what to make of Madame Jane's words. Was she suggesting that Emma could see Jack's spirit? Could it be possible that there was some truth to the child's claims? Or was this simply a grieving child's mind playing tricks? But the look in Emma's eyes, the way she was fixated on the dark corner of the room, made Grace uneasy. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that it was just the pain of losing Jack that was clouding her thoughts. But the air felt too heavy, too charged with something that couldn't be explained. "Grace!" said a familiar voice, breaking her from her reverie. It was David, Jack's cousin. He had been standing at the back of the church, watching the proceedings with an almost detached air. His cold, calculating eyes met hers as he approached, and there was something unsettling in his gaze. "You must be exhausted," David said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. He smiled, but the warmth in his expression didn't reach his eyes. "I know it's been a difficult day for you." Grace nodded absently, not sure how to respond. Her mind was still spinning, her thoughts a tangled mess of grief and uncertainty. David's smile faded as he looked down at Emma, who was still sobbing, her eyes wide with fear. His gaze lingered on the child for a moment before he spoke again. "Grace, I hate to bring this up now, but you know, Jack left behind quite a bit of debt," he said, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "It might be best to sell the house to settle things." Grace stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. She looked up at David, trying to process his words. How could he think about money at a time like this? How could he even suggest such a thing when they hadn't even laid Jack to rest yet? "David, not now," she replied, her voice firmer than she intended. "We can talk about that later." But David didn't seem to take the hint. He smiled again, though it lacked any real warmth. "I'm just thinking about what's best for you and Emma," he said, his tone almost condescending. "Jack would want you to be practical, to settle his affairs quickly. If you don't, the law might get involved. We don't want that, do we?" Grace's stomach twisted. There was something about David's insistence, something too urgent in his voice, that made her skin crawl. He didn't seem to care about the mourning, about the pain she was going through. All he seemed to care about was the house, the debts, the assets. "David, please," Grace said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not now." But David just nodded, his smile never faltering. "I'll give you some time to think about it," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving Grace to wonder why he was so eager to discuss finances at such a sensitive time. Grace's heart raced as she watched him walk away, the unease growing within her. There was something about David's calm demeanor that unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, something that went beyond the surface. Why was he so eager to discuss money? To push her into selling the house? What was he really after? As Grace turned back to Emma, who was still clinging to her, she felt a wave of dread wash over her. The tension in the church seemed to grow thicker, and the shadows in the corner where Emma had been pointing now felt darker, more menacing. The questions continued to swirl in her mind. Was Emma really seeing something that no one else could? Was her daughter's innocent vision a sign of something far more sinister? And why did David seem so intent on taking advantage of her grief? Grace tightened her grip on Emma's small hand. Something wasn't right, and the unsettling feeling gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. What was she missing? What was lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? The mystery was only beginning to unfold. The church was quiet now, save for the soft sobs that came from the mourners who had gathered to say their final goodbyes. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of grief and unanswered questions. The lingering scent of incense mixed with the faint trace of freshly cut flowers as Grace stood by Jack's coffin, trying desperately to hold herself together for Emma. But inside, she felt like her world was crumbling. David had left her side only moments before, but his words had planted a seed of unease deep in her heart. "We need to sell the house," he had said, as casually as if they were discussing the weather. Grace had shaken her head in disbelief, her grief momentarily overshadowed by the insensitivity of his timing. How could he bring up something like that now, of all times? Jack's body was still warm, and yet David was already speaking of practicalities, of debts, of things that felt so far removed from the loss she was experiencing. "Emma, sweetheart, you need to rest," Grace whispered, trying to calm her daughter, who was still clinging to her side, her tear-filled eyes never leaving the coffin. "Papa's gone. He's not trapped. He's not calling for us." Emma, however, continued to point to the dark corner of the room, her voice rising as she repeated her heartbreaking claim. "Papa's calling for me. He's scared. He's trapped in there, Mama. Help him." Grace's chest tightened at the sound of her daughter's words. She had tried to reassure Emma time and again, but the child's insistence made something deep within Grace stir. Could Emma be sensing something that no one else could see? Was there truth to the child's words, or was it simply the mind of a grieving child playing tricks? Emma's eyes were wide, filled with fear, but Grace could not make sense of it. She took a deep breath, willing herself to push past the feeling of dread, when she saw David approaching once more. "Grace," David began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, as he made his way toward her. His eyes, cold and calculating, bore into her. "I know this is a hard time, but the sooner we take care of things, the better." He spoke as though he were discussing a business transaction, not the affairs of a grieving widow. Grace felt her stomach turn. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and frustration. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Jack left behind significant debts. The house, it's the only asset worth anything. You can't keep it, Grace. Not with all the bills piling up." He paused, watching her closely, as though assessing her reaction. "I'm just trying to help you get through this. I know it's overwhelming, but you have to think about what's best for you and Emma." Grace stiffened, a sudden wave of anger flooding her chest. "David," she said through gritted teeth, "this is not the time for money, not now. Can't you see we're mourning? We just buried my husband." Her voice cracked, but she fought to keep her composure. David's smile didn't falter. "I understand. But if you don't make a decision soon, the law might get involved. You don't want to face that, do you?" Grace recoiled, taken aback by his cold, calculated words. "What do you mean, the law?" she asked, her mind racing. Why was he so eager to push this? Why was he so insistent on selling the house when her husband had barely been gone a day? David's eyes darkened slightly, his tone sharpening. "You have bills to pay, Grace. Debts that Jack didn't leave behind a solution for. The house is the only option. If you don't sell, things could get messy. The law will get involved, and I don't want that for you. Not after everything you've been through." The words hung in the air like a threat, cold and unmistakable. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Was David trying to manipulate her? Was he only concerned about money, about securing his own future, rather than the well-being of her and Emma? "David, I can't—" Grace began, but he cut her off, his voice becoming more forceful. "I'm just saying it's for your own good, Grace," David said, his smile widening, but now tinged with something darker. "You don't want to be left with nothing, do you?" Grace took a step back, her hands trembling as she held on to Emma, who was still fixated on the coffin. The child's insistence grew louder, more desperate. "Papa! Papa's calling for help!" Emma cried, her voice breaking. She pointed at the coffin again, her body shaking with terror. The room seemed to shift as Grace's gaze flickered from David's calculating face to Emma, whose innocent words now seemed to carry an eerie weight. Was this just grief manifesting itself? Or was there something more? Why did Emma seem so certain, so utterly convinced that Jack was still alive, that he was trapped and calling for them? David's eyes narrowed as he glanced at Emma, then back at Grace. "The child's just grieving, Grace," he said, in a low, dismissive tone. "She doesn't understand. It's best to let her be. We have more important things to worry about now." But Grace could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. Something was wrong. Her mind was clouded with doubts, and David's behavior only made it worse. His lack of sensitivity, his coldness in the face of their loss. It was as if he was seeing everything through a lens of profit and practicality, rather than empathy. Why was he pushing so hard to settle these matters now, at the expense of their grief? Emma's cries grew more frantic, her small hands tugging at Grace's dress. "Mama, please! Papa needs us! He's stuck, he's scared!" The words sent a shiver through Grace's spine. Could it be possible? Could Jack have been buried alive, just a victim of some horrific accident? Was it truly just her daughter's imagination, or was there something more to the story? And why was David acting so oddly, as if he were hiding something? The tension between Grace and David escalated. She could feel her heart racing, her mind in turmoil. "I don't want to talk about this anymore," Grace said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Not now. Not like this. We will deal with it when the time is right." David gave a small, mocking smile, but his eyes betrayed a hint of frustration. "Of course," he said coolly, "but you'll see. It's better to deal with these things now than to wait until it's too late." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Grace standing in the middle of the church, her head spinning. As she watched David retreat into the shadows of the church, the unease in Grace's chest only deepened. Was it truly just about the house, about settling Jack's debts? Or was there something more sinister at play? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as Emma's cries rang in her ears. Grace's thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of doubt. Could Jack have been buried alive? Was David involved in something darker than just financial matters? She didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. The atmosphere in the church had shifted. The mourners, once quietly grieving, were now whispering among themselves, casting sidelong glances at the coffin and at Grace. She could feel their eyes on her, as if waiting for something to happen, as if they too were sensing that something wasn't quite right. As the day dragged on, Grace found it harder and harder to push the unsettling thoughts away. Emma's words, David's strange behavior, the cold dread that clung to her like a shadow, it all blended together into a thick, suffocating atmosphere. Grace's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, and her heart felt heavy with a growing sense of fear. Was Jack truly gone? Or had something darker taken place? The tension in the church seemed to grow with each passing moment, and with every tear Emma shed, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering a terrible truth. The church was still and heavy with the sound of murmuring voices. The air felt thick, thick with grief, with suspicion, and with something else that Grace couldn't quite name. She stood at the edge of the room, still holding on to Emma, whose sobs had subsided into quiet, fearful whimpers. Emma's wide eyes were locked on the coffin again, her small body trembling as she whispered over and over, "Papa's calling for me. He's trapped." Grace's heart twisted in her chest, and as much as she tried to comfort Emma, the child wouldn't let go of her fears. As the minutes dragged on, Grace found herself lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, none of which could bring her any peace. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, something that went beyond grief, beyond the sadness of losing Jack. It wasn't just Emma's eerie insistence that her father was still alive. It wasn't just David's strange urgency to sell the house. No, something else lurked beneath the surface, something dark, something that Grace was beginning to fear. David had been insistent, too insistent. Ever since Jack's passing, he'd been hovering around, trying to push Grace into making decisions that didn't feel right, that felt out of place in the midst of their mourning. Grace had been too distracted to fully process his words at first, but now, looking back, his actions were beginning to make more sense in a way that made her stomach churn. Jack had always been firm when it came to the house. He'd worked so hard to build it, to make a home for their family. He had refused to sell, no matter what financial hardships they faced. Grace remembered the many late nights they spent discussing the bills, the pressure of their debts, and Jack's insistence that they would hold on to the house for as long as they could. He had been adamant. "We'll find a way," he had told her. "We can't give up what we've worked for." So why, just days after Jack's death, was David pushing her to sell? Why was he so eager to settle things, to resolve matters of money, when they hadn't even buried Jack yet? She recalled the coldness in his voice when he had mentioned the law getting involved, the way he'd insinuated that the house was the only way out. It wasn't right. It didn't add up. And the more Grace thought about it, the more she began to suspect that David knew more than he was letting on. "Grace," a voice interrupted her thoughts, drawing her out of her reverie. It was Madame Jane, the elderly woman who had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. Grace hadn't noticed her approach, but now the woman stood beside her, her eyes sharp with concern. "Madame Jane," Grace said softly, her voice trembling. She had no energy to pretend she was fine anymore. The weight of the situation was becoming too much. "I don't know what's happening. Everything feels wrong, and I don't know who to trust." Madame Jane's wrinkled hand gently placed itself on Grace's arm. She looked at Grace with knowing eyes, eyes that had seen more than Grace could ever understand. "There are things beyond our understanding, Grace," she said quietly, her voice thick with age. "Things we can't always explain. Sometimes children can see what we cannot, sense what we've lost sight of." Grace's heart skipped a beat as Madame Jane spoke. Was she suggesting that Emma's strange behavior wasn't just a child's imagination? That there might be some truth to Emma's words about Jack still being alive? Madame Jane continued, her voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "Many years ago, something similar happened in this village. A man was believed to be dead, his body laid out just like Jack's. But later, when the family had already buried him, they found out the truth. He hadn't died. He had been in a deep coma, trapped in his own body, unable to move or speak. His family thought he was gone, but he was very much alive." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Could Jack have been buried alive, trapped in some kind of coma? The thought was too horrific to entertain, but as she looked at Emma, still clinging to her, still whispering about Jack's calls for help, Grace felt an unshakable chill run through her. What if Emma was right? What if Jack hadn't truly died? "Why didn't they open the coffin?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. But that was years ago, Grace. And some things in this village, well, they're not so easily forgotten. Madam Jane's words hung in the air, their meaning clear. There was something the villagers knew, something that had been buried along with the dead, and it seemed like it was starting to resurface. Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. Could this be happening again? Could Jack still be alive, trapped somewhere in the dark coffin, waiting for someone to save him? But how could that be? How could such a mistake happen again? And why did it feel like the truth was slipping through her fingers, always just out of reach? As if on cue, Emma's voice broke through Grace's spiraling thoughts. "Mama, Papa's calling me. He's scared. He's waiting for me," Emma cried, her voice high and filled with terror. Her little hands trembled as she pointed once again to the coffin, her face contorted with fear. The words echoed in Grace's mind, gnawing at her. What if it wasn't just grief? What if it was something more? Could Emma be sensing something that no one else could? Grace felt a lump form in her throat, her mind torn between disbelief and the growing sense that something wasn't right. She had to know. She had to find out the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. As Grace stood there, overwhelmed by doubt and fear, her thoughts turned to David. His insistence that she sell the house, his cold behavior, the way he seemed to push her toward decisions she wasn't ready to make. It was all starting to feel too orchestrated, too rehearsed. Could he have known something? Could he have had a hand in this? The more Grace thought about it, the more she realized that David's actions weren't just about money. There was something else at play, something darker that he wasn't willing to reveal. "David, could you be hiding something?" Grace muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. Her heart was heavy with the burden of the unanswered questions that swirled in her mind. Could Jack have been buried alive? Had David somehow been involved in this? Was Jack's death truly an accident? Or was there something sinister behind it? She didn't know. But one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. She had to find the truth, even if it meant confronting the impossible. The atmosphere in the church felt charged with tension. Every breath Grace took seemed to add to the weight of the questions pressing down on her. As the hours passed, she knew that she couldn't stay in the dark any longer. She had to face the truth, no matter what it might be. With Emma still clinging to her side, still whispering of Jack's calls for help, Grace resolved to uncover what had really happened. She couldn't let the fear control her anymore. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and she would find it, no matter where it led. With her heart pounding in her chest, Grace looked once more at the coffin, her resolve hardening. She would not leave until she knew the truth. The once quiet and peaceful church now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the very air had thickened in response to the tension. The warm sunlight that had filtered through the stained glass windows just hours before had given way to shadows, and the temperature had dropped inexplicably, sending a chill through Grace's bones. She glanced around the room, her eyes catching the nervous glances of the villagers, who seemed to be moving away from her and Emma. It was as if some invisible force had swept through the room, pushing them into the corners, keeping their distance. The mourners who had once gathered to grieve were now unsure, uncomfortable, and afraid. Grace could feel it, could feel the shift in the room, the growing sense of unease that made her skin crawl. The whispers had started, quiet at first, but now they were louder, more frantic, mixing with the soft sobs of the people who remained. Grace knew they weren't just whispering about the grief of losing Jack. They were whispering about her, about Emma, about the strange things that were happening. They were afraid of what might happen next, of what Emma had said, of what Grace might uncover. Emma, still clinging to Grace, continued to point at the coffin, her voice soft but insistent. "Papa is scared, Mama. He's calling for help." Each time Emma spoke, it sent a wave of unease through Grace, but this time the words seemed to carry more weight. They echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again, until she couldn't shake them. Was it just a child's fantasy? Or was there something real, something dark, that no one could explain? Grace's heart raced, and her mind spun. She had been trying to ignore the growing fear that had settled in her chest, trying to push away the doubts that had been creeping in ever since David's sudden insistence that she sell the house. But now, as she watched Emma, as she saw the villagers distancing themselves from her, the truth seemed to be bubbling to the surface, and it was too much to ignore any longer. A moment of realization hit her like a lightning bolt, a sharp clarity that pierced through the fog of confusion and fear. She had been so caught up in her grief, so wrapped up in her mourning for Jack, that she hadn't fully registered the subtle hints David had dropped. His calm insistence on selling the house, his sudden pressure on her to take action, even before they'd buried Jack, now made sense in a way that sent a chill through her body. Jack had always been adamant that the house was non-negotiable. He loved it. He had worked tirelessly to provide it for their family, and no matter how dire their financial situation had become, he refused to let it go. And now, barely days after Jack's passing, David had all but demanded that she sell it. He had insisted it was the only way to settle Jack's debts, to take care of everything quickly. But now Grace realized it wasn't just about settling debts. David had known something, had wanted something. David had been too eager to push her into making that decision. His calm demeanor, his insistence on moving quickly, it all pointed to one thing. He was trying to get her to sell before she could question anything, before she could process what had really happened to Jack. Could he have been involved in Jack's death? Was Jack's sudden demise not an accident at all, but something darker? Was it possible that David had played a part in it? The realization hit Grace like a punch to the gut. The image of David's cold eyes, the way he'd been so quick to discuss money, now felt like a slap in the face. Could he have been involved? Was this really just about money for him, or had something else been at play? The thought that Jack might have been taken from her, that he might have been deliberately harmed for the sake of property, of financial gain, made Grace feel sick to her stomach. "Papa is scared, Mama. He's calling for help," Emma whispered again, her tiny voice trembling with fear. Grace's heart thudded painfully in her chest. What did this mean? What was she supposed to believe? Her instincts screamed at her to act, to uncover the truth, but fear kept her rooted in place. She had to confront David. She had to get the answers, but she was terrified of what those answers might reveal. Just then, the door to the church creaked open, and David walked back into the room. His steps were measured, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Grace. He smiled, but there was something forced about it. It was as if he were trying too hard to mask the tension in his body. His calm demeanor, which had unsettled Grace earlier, was now wearing thin. "Grace," David said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge of desperation. "I see you're still upset. I just want to help. We need to settle this matter with the house, for Emma's sake." Grace couldn't hide the coldness that had settled in her chest. "I don't need your help, David," she snapped, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I need the truth. What happened to Jack? Why are you so eager to sell the house? Why didn't you care that we were grieving?" David's smile faltered, and his eyes flickered with something darker. "Grace, you're letting emotions cloud your judgment. This is just business. You need to be practical. Jack would want you to do this. I'm trying to help you. But if you keep resisting, it's only going to make things harder." His words became more erratic, more frantic, and Grace saw the mask of calm slip further away. David's desperation was clear now. He wasn't just trying to convince her to sell the house anymore. He was afraid. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his eyes darted around the room, as though he were trying to read the reactions of the other villagers.
"David,"
Grace said, her voice low but filled with a growing fury.
"what do you know? What are you hiding?"
David's expression twisted. For a moment, he was silent, his jaw clenched tight as he avoided her gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, raw with something Grace couldn't place. "You don't know what you're asking, Grace," he said, his words sharp. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're dealing with." The rising tension in the church was palpable now. The whispers grew louder, the villagers exchanging uneasy glances, their fear evident in their wide eyes. It wasn't just Emma's insistence about Jack. It wasn't just Grace's growing doubts. The room itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, for the truth to come crashing down. And as Grace's gaze met David's, she realized that the truth was out there, just beyond her reach. But David was desperate to keep it hidden. Grace stepped closer, her resolve hardening. She could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders, the oppressive fear that hung in the air.
"David, you're hiding something,"
she said, her voice trembling but firm. "And I won't stop until I find out what it is." David's face turned pale, and for the first time, Grace saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He was afraid, and that only made her more certain that he knew something she needed to know. Before she could say another word, the door to the church swung open once again. This time, it wasn't David, but a stranger. A tall man in a dark suit, his face stern and serious. He moved quickly toward the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto Grace. "I'm Dr. Thomas," the man said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I've been asked to conduct an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Jack's death." Grace felt her stomach drop. The words sent a shockwave through the room, and for the first time since Jack's death, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was about to be revealed. "I've reviewed the medical records," Dr. Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving Grace. "And there's something you need to know. Jack's death certificate, there's a problem with it." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The truth was about to come out. The church was unnervingly silent. The only sound the soft, anxious murmur of the villagers who had gathered, their collective breath held in anticipation. The flickering candles cast long shadows along the walls, the darkening atmosphere amplifying the sense of dread that had steadily grown throughout the day. Every movement felt heightened, every glance laden with suspicion, as Grace stood frozen before the coffin, her heart racing in her chest. The weight of Dr. Thomas's words still lingered, his revelation cutting through the air like a thunderclap. Jack's death certificate was a lie. He had not died. He had been drugged into a coma. Grace's mind reeled with the implications. The horror that surged within her was almost too much to bear. Jack, her Jack, hadn't been dead at all. She had buried him, believing he was gone forever, when in fact he had still been alive, trapped in a state of unconsciousness. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her knees buckled slightly as the reality of it settled in. How could she have missed the signs? How could anyone have let this happen? Dr. Thomas stepped forward again, his face grave, his tone professional but laced with urgency. "I've reviewed the medical records thoroughly. There was no formal confirmation of Jack's death. His body was never properly examined after his death. The death certificate was forged." A wave of nausea rose in Grace's throat, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the pew for support. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, their stares filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Emma's soft, trembling hand still clung to her, and her little voice broke through the tension like a lifeline. "Papa is calling for Mama," Emma cried again, her voice filled with pure terror. "Papa's scared. He needs me, Mama." Grace felt her heart shatter as she turned to look at Emma, whose innocent, pleading eyes were fixed on the coffin. The words echoed in Grace's mind, and something deep within her shifted. She had to know. She had to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. But the fear clawed at her, the doubts that had been growing steadily in her chest, now threatening to consume her. What if Emma was wrong? What if opening that coffin would bring more pain than she could bear? But there was no time left for doubts. "Grace," Dr. Thomas said, his voice low but insistent. "You need to make a decision. We can't leave it like this. If Jack is alive, he needs help. If he's still alive, we must act quickly. But if he's gone—" Grace's eyes locked onto Dr. Thomas's, and she could see the gravity in his face. It was the truth, finally. Jack had not died of an accident, nor had he succumbed to some cruel twist of fate. He had been alive, trapped in that coffin, and for reasons Grace couldn't yet comprehend, it had been kept from her. Emma's cries grew louder, more urgent. "Papa's calling for Mama. Please, Mama, help him." She tugged harder at Grace's dress, her small body trembling with fear and distress. It was too much. Grace's mind raced with the impossible choice before her. To open the coffin would risk uncovering the worst possible truth. Would Jack be able to forgive her for not acting sooner? Would she be able to live with the consequences of disturbing his rest, if he truly was at peace? But if he was alive, if Emma's words were right, then she had no choice but to open it. The doubt that had plagued her all day, about David, about Jack's sudden death, now gnawed at her with renewed urgency. Grace's gaze shifted back to David, standing a few feet away. His posture had stiffened, and his eyes darted nervously toward the coffin. His usual calm was gone now, replaced by a frantic energy that made his earlier attempts to dismiss Emma's cries seem even more suspect. As Grace locked eyes with him, she saw it. Fear. The man who had been so cold, so calculating, was now clearly afraid, and that fear only fueled her own. David stepped forward, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Grace, please, this is madness. We can't do this. You're just scaring yourself and the child with these fantasies." Grace's heart thudded heavily in her chest, but she could feel the fire of determination growing within her. David's panic was evident now, his calm veneer slipping with every word. He was terrified, and that terrified her more than anything. "Why are you so afraid, David?" Grace demanded, her voice cold and sharp. "What aren't you telling me? Why have you pushed so hard for the house to be sold? Why didn't you want anyone to know the truth?" David's face tightened, his features hardening into a mask of fury. "Grace, you don't know what you're doing. This is all just superstition. You're making a mistake, and you'll regret it." His voice grew louder, more erratic, as if trying to drown out the growing tension in the room. "You don't need to open that coffin. It's over. We need to move on. Let Jack go." Grace stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. "No, I won't let Jack go. Not until I know the truth. Not until I know what happened." David's breathing grew heavier, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Grace. You can't just go digging into the past. Leave it alone." But Grace wasn't listening anymore. She was beyond reason now. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by an unyielding need for answers. She had to know. She couldn't live with the doubt anymore. "Move aside, David," Grace said firmly, her voice unshakable. She turned to the coffin, taking a step closer, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The knocking sounds from inside the coffin had stopped for a moment, but now, as if in response to her defiance, they began again. Thud, thud, thud. Louder and more frantic than before. "Don't do this, Grace!" David shouted, his voice desperate. He lunged forward, his hands grabbing at her arm, but she pulled away, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let him stop her. Not now. Grace's fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of the coffin lid. With one last look at the villagers, who stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief, she lifted the lid. The room seemed to gasp as the lid creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the coffin. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. And then, as the coffin lid was fully raised, Grace gasped. There, lying motionless but unmistakably alive, was Jack. His skin was ghostly pale, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his body trembled slightly with the faintest of breaths. His eyes fluttered open, weak but conscious, blinking as if trying to adjust to the light. Grace's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Jack," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. He blinked again, his eyes locking with hers, and though his voice was barely a whisper, it was enough. "Grace, Emma, I'm here." His voice was weak, but unmistakable. Grace's knees buckled as she sank to the floor beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. Jack was alive. He had been buried alive. Emma's sobs echoed through the room, her small hands reaching for her father. "Papa! Papa, you're awake!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. Jack weakly embraced her, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. The entire church was in shock. Villagers gasped, some backing away, others crossing themselves in disbelief. The air in the room seemed to shift, and a palpable sense of awe filled the space. Grace could hardly believe what she was seeing, but there was no doubt now. Jack was alive. But as the crowd continued to stare, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. The questions swirled in Grace's mind, questions that still needed answers. Who had done this? Why had Jack been left to die in such a horrific way? There were still so many things to uncover, and Grace knew that this was only the beginning. But for now, Jack was alive, and that was the truth she had been searching for all along. The church was still in shock, the villagers standing motionless, their eyes fixed on Jack, who lay before them, barely conscious but alive. It was as if the world had stopped turning for a moment, leaving only the weight of the truth hanging in the air like an unbearable burden. Grace, still kneeling beside Jack, felt the trembling warmth of his hand in hers, the pulse beneath his skin, unmistakable. He was alive. After all this time, after everything they had been through, he was here, and he was breathing. The reality of what had just happened began to settle in, and Grace felt a knot of relief in her chest. But even that relief was clouded by the darkness of what she knew had taken place. Her husband had been buried alive, his life stolen from him by the very person who should have been his family, his cousin, David. The thought made her sick. She squeezed Jack's hand tighter, trying to hold on to him, to keep him grounded in the world they had almost lost. But their reprieve was short-lived. Outside, the sound of sirens began to wail, growing louder and louder until they filled the church, the sirens cutting through the stillness with a sense of finality. It was time for the truth to come out. As Grace turned to look, a uniformed officer stepped into the church, followed by two others. Their presence was a sudden, jarring reminder that justice was still to come, that this was far from over. Grace looked at Jack, who was now struggling to sit up, his face pale but determined. He was alive, but the weight of what had happened to him, to their family, would not be easily lifted. "Mr. Herrera," one of the officers said, his voice firm but respectful, "we need to speak with you. We've come to investigate what's happened here." David, who had been watching the events unfold from the back of the room, shifted nervously, his eyes darting from the officers to Grace to the coffin that had just been opened. His face paled as the realization settled over him. There would be no escaping the truth now. David tried to stand tall, to maintain the facade of composure he had worn so carefully throughout the ordeal. "There's been some mistake," he said, his voice rising with false confidence. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I don't know why you're making a scene." The officers exchanged a look, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Grace's blood ran cold as she watched David's nervousness seep through his words. She knew he had been involved. She had known it for a while, but seeing him try to feign innocence only solidified her certainty. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. "David Jimenez," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Jack Herrera, for fraud, and for conspiracy to bury a living person." The words hit like a slap. Grace's body trembled with disbelief, but in the depths of her heart, there was no surprise. David's face twisted with a flash of rage, his calm mask finally slipping. He was caught. "No!" David shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "This isn't what you think. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help. You don't understand. He didn't. He was going to sell the house anyway. It was all about the house. You don't understand." The officers moved in, handcuffing him swiftly as the villagers watched, some in shock, others in anger. Grace's mind was spinning, but she could barely focus on anything except the fact that this man who had been like family, had betrayed them all. He had betrayed Jack in the worst possible way. The realization of how deep the deceit had run was almost too much to bear. David was led out of the church, still shouting, still trying to explain himself, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the villagers murmuring. The room was filled with a strange mixture of fear, anger, and relief. Grace watched, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of the reckoning that awaited David, but for now he was being taken away, and justice, however delayed, was finally making its way toward them. The church doors closed behind the officers, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Grace began to lift, if only for a moment. She turned back to Jack, who was now being carefully supported by Matthew and several other villagers. He was awake, conscious, and breathing, but his body was frail, weak from the horrors he had endured. His eyes met hers, and despite the exhaustion etched into his face, a small smile tugged at his lips. "Grace," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse, but filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to go through this." Grace shook her head, tears falling freely now, as she reached out to hold his face, to touch the man she thought she had lost forever. "No, Jack. You don't have to apologize. You're here. That's all that matters. You're alive." She kissed him gently, her lips lingering on his, feeling the pulse of life beneath his skin. In that moment, all the pain, all the fear, seemed to fade into the background. Jack was alive. He was with her again. As they sat together, their hands entwined, Grace couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. She had never given up hope, never lost faith in the belief that they would be reunited. Even when the darkness seemed too much to bear, even when David's shadow loomed over them, Grace had held on to the love that had kept them strong. It was Emma's innocent intuition, her unwavering belief in her father's presence, that had led them here. And for that, Grace would be forever grateful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the church, Grace looked at Jack, his weary but grateful face filled with the love they had both fought so hard to protect. The sound of the police cars leaving the scene echoed faintly outside, but inside the church there was only the sound of Grace's steady breathing and Jack's weak but steady heartbeats. The court trial began shortly thereafter, and as Jack recovered, the legal proceedings unfolded. David's arrest was only the beginning of his reckoning. He would be tried for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to bury a living person. The villagers, once fearful and divided, now stood united in their resolve to seek justice. The truth had been revealed, and David's fate was sealed. As Grace sat beside Jack in the courtroom, the weight of the past weeks seemed to settle, but the pain still lingered. It wasn't just the physical wounds Jack had endured, or the emotional toll of the betrayal. They had both been changed by the experience, scarred by the darkness that had threatened to tear them apart. But they were still here, still fighting for each other, still bound by the love that had never faltered. The trial was long, the evidence damning. But when the day of judgment finally came, Jack stood before the court, his voice strong despite the frailty of his body. His statement echoed through the room, a powerful reminder of the strength of family, of love, and of justice. "David," Jack said, his eyes steady and unwavering as he faced the man who had betrayed him. "You may have thought you could take my life, take my family, for your own gain, but you were wrong. This is not just about me. It's about everything we fought for. It's about the love that endures, no matter what you try to do to break it. You can't bury what's alive. You can't steal what's never yours." The judge's gavel struck down, sentencing David to 25 years in prison for his crimes. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Grace only had eyes for Jack. As they left the courtroom, hand in hand, they knew that the battle was over. But the healing had only just begun. Their love, their persistence, and their unwavering belief in the truth had won out, and together they would rebuild their lives, stronger, wiser, and united. The final words of the trial echoed in Grace's heart as they walked into the future. Love, persistence, and the ultimate victory of truth. They were the foundation on which their new life would be built. The days that followed the trial were a blur for Grace, Jack, and Emma. It was as if they had stepped into a new world, one free from the shadows that had once threatened to swallow them whole. The weight of the past, the pain of betrayal, the fear that had haunted them for so long, was slowly lifting. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were free to breathe, to heal, and to rebuild. Grace couldn't help but marvel at the simple beauty of their newfound peace. Their home, which had once felt cold and hollow, was now filled with the warmth of love and laughter. It was a place where memories could be made, where hope could take root, and where they could finally feel safe. Jack, though still recovering physically from the horrors he had endured, was gradually regaining his strength. The man she had loved and feared losing forever was here with her, by her side. He had returned to her, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to start over, to rebuild their family. Emma, too, was adjusting to the change. The little girl who had once been consumed with fear and uncertainty was now blossoming in the safety of her parents' love. She had always known something others couldn't see, a truth buried deep within her heart. Emma's unwavering belief in the power of love and family had guided them through the darkest days, and now she was free to simply be a child again. The healing process was slow, but every day brought them closer to the life they had dreamed of. There were still moments of sadness, moments when Grace would catch herself in a quiet corner, reflecting on all they had been through. But those moments were no longer filled with despair. Instead, they were filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the love that had sustained them, for the truth that had set them free, and for the family that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Jack, though physically frail, never stopped working to rebuild their life. He started slowly, planting a garden, fixing the small things around the house that had been left undone. With each step forward, the house became more of a home again. He had always been the rock in their family, the one who kept them grounded. And now, as he grew stronger, Grace felt his presence, like a steady heartbeat beside her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the field outside their home. Grace stood with Jack on the porch, watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard. The simple joy of watching their daughter run, carefree and happy, brought tears to Grace's eyes. It was the kind of moment she had dreamed of for so long, the kind of moment she had feared she would never experience again. Jack wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We made it, Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it through the storm." Grace nodded, her heart full. "Yes, we did, and we'll keep moving forward, together." As they watched Emma play, their hearts filled with a deep sense of peace. They had fought for each other, for their family, and now they were finally free to embrace the future. They had survived the worst of it, and now they could move forward with hope, knowing that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. But beyond the immediate joy of their reunion, Grace couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had taken to get here. The truth had set them free, but it had also come at a high cost. Betrayal, fear, and loss had all played their parts in shaping their story. Yet through it all, love had been their guiding light. It had kept them grounded, kept them fighting when it seemed like there was no hope left. Now, as they stood at the beginning of their new life, Grace knew that the most important lesson they had learned was the power of truth and love. Truth had brought justice, had uncovered the lies that had been buried in the shadows. Love had kept them together, had given them the strength to face the darkness and come out the other side stronger. And family was the bond that held them all together, no matter what. Looking out at the horizon, Grace couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, standing together, with the future stretched out before them. The past no longer had power over them. They had been set free, and now they could build the life they had always dreamed of. As the evening drew to a close, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Grace turned to Jack, her eyes filled with love. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jack smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Yes, we have. But we're here now, and that's all that matters." Together, they watched as Emma ran toward them, her laughter echoing in the quiet night. In that moment, it felt as though time had slowed down. They had made it through the storm, and now they could finally begin again. The future was theirs to shape, to mold, and to fill with love. Grace took Jack's hand, her heart swelling with love for him and for their daughter. "This is our new beginning," she said softly, "and it's just the start of everything." The camera slowly zoomed out, capturing the peaceful scene of the three of them standing together, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The music swelled gently in the background, adding a sense of warmth and hope to the scene. As the video came to a close, a message appeared on the screen. "Thank you for watching. The truth may take time to surface, but love and family will always see us through. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming and suspenseful stories that will remind you of the power of truth, justice, and the unbreakable bond of family." The screen faded to black, leaving the viewer with a lingering sense of hope, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love would always prevail.